Lord God, we thank you for the opportunity to gather here today to learn about your servant Paul. Help us to listen to what you say to us. Help us to speak to each other and help us to learn from each other so that we can all grow stronger in your faith this Lenten season. Amen. Okay. Let me leave this seat in case someone else comes in. Last week we finished the first missionary journey. And I bet you all thought, boy, he's done. Well, not exactly. First of all, last week we talked about the decision that was made by the elders when Paul, remember, Paul and Barnabas went to Jerusalem for a big meeting of the church. Okay, we read about that. What was that meeting about? Yes, it was about whether you had to become Jewish first before you could become Christian. Because most of the early converts were Jewish. And the reason Paul had a problem with this is because everywhere he went, he had more Gentile converts than he had Jewish converts. So he wanted to know what should we do now? Okay, so they decided that you don't have to be Jewish first. And that was major, because now Paul can make 2 other journeys and not have that over his head. Okay, and that also lasts until today. So this was very, very, very important. The second question was, who is Silas? Remember, up to now we've had Paul and Barnabas. Where did Silas come from? It was at the end of last week we talked about it.
He replaced Barnabas.
That's right. He replaced Barnabas because Barnabas wanted to take our friend John Mark that we've been talking about and on the second journey, and Paul didn't want to because John Mark abandoned them on the first journey. So they got into a bit of a, shall we say, disagreement. Cassie Wolf was here last week. She's a pastor, and she said a little more than a disagreement, but anyway, it was a little nasty. So they decided to part company. So Barnabas took John Mark with him, and Paul took Silas, who he just met. So anyway, that's where we are. They're getting ready to make this second journey. However, before that, on Acts 16, everybody turn to that. On Acts 16, there is an interesting meeting. All right, and it's not on the tape. But anyway, 16. Who can read Acts 16 verses 1 to 5? Okay.
He came from Debre and then to Lycia, where the disciples named Timothy lived, whose mother was a Jewish and a believer, but those fathers was Greek. Others in Lycia and Icon spoke well of him. Paul wanted to take him along on that journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area. Were they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they traveled from town to town, they delivered the decision reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers.
Okay, so stop and think. Paul just went and said you don't have to be circumcised first. Right? So why did he ask Timothy to get circumcised?
Because of his mother?
Well, actually, it's because of credibility. Okay? Remember, Timothy's father was Greek. So he wanted everybody to understand that this guy knew what he was talking about. So he asked them to be circumcised, so that way he could say he was, you know, he's half Jewish, he knows the faith, da da da, he's with me, all that sort of thing. So it seems like an odd thing to do, but that's what they did. Now, keep Timothy in mind. He comes and he goes from this point. All right. Also, there's a book, Timothy, isn't there? This is a letter that Paul would write to Timothy after he sent him on his way. So now Paul has Silas and he has Timothy with him. So that he's building a little bit of an entourage as he goes along. Okay? So now where did they go now? Well, they went through a whole bunch of places we'll see on the tape. But before that, I'd like someone to read Acts 16, 6-10.
Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of
That's Phrygia.
Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter
Bithynia.
Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Syria and went down to
Troas.
During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, he got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them.
Okay. Two things, we're going to see on the tape what this means, because this was quite a trip for him. But also, in verse 10, the word "us" appears. So it is likely that Luke, who wrote this book, is with them too. Now, there's some debate on that, but he uses the verb "us," and he's the writer. So, it is known that Luke had a tendency to travel with Paul from time to time. So now this entourage that started out with 2, now there's 4 of them. Okay, and they're all together, and they're all going to one place. And here is what this thing would look like. You can get an idea of the area they're going to. First of all, they're going to Gordios. Listen to this.
He didn't know it, but an oracle had prophesied that an old wagon would bring them a king, would put an end to all their troubles. And when he rode his wagon up to the temple of Zeus, he at once was made king of the Phrygians. His son was King Midas, who was to ask Dionysus of a favor, that all things which he touched should be changed to gold. He received his wish, but now even the food that he touched became gold, and he finally begged the god to take the favor back. Midas lies in his tomb, shaped like a pyramid, next to the ancient city of Gordios. It was here that the young Alexander was offered the key to Asia, if he could just untie the Gordian knot. Alexander solved the problem by cutting the knot with his sword, and since then, cutting the Gordian knot has become proverbial for finding a way out of a difficulty. The tomb for Alexander the Great was prepared by a Greek sculptor in the port city of Sidon. Alexander never used this tomb. He died in Babylon and was buried in Alexandria. But here he is, conquering the Persian king Darius, only to marry his beautiful daughter Barsinoe. Paul moves through the countryside, past the tomb of King Midas and the ancient city of Gordion, and on through the rolling countryside towards Alexandria, Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." Luke goes on to tell us. After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. They embarked from the port of Alexandria Troas in the Troad and sailed out across the northern reaches of the Aegean Sea. They passed by the island of Samothrace and arrived eventually at the port city of Neapolis. The ancient harbor of Neapolis is now called Kavala in northern Greece, and the ancient harbor of Neapolis is virtually intact. Here the fishermen still repair their nets as they did in ancient times. The fishermen work at night. These bulbous lanterns at the stern end of their fishing dories are used to attract the fish into the nets. A block away from the harbor is St. Paul's Church, and in the courtyard is a stone bollard used by sailors to step off the ships in ancient times. Paul could have used this bollard as a stepping stone. Here in Kavala, they deliver the milk late in the afternoon instead of early morning hours. And occasionally, Greeks will wear the colors of their country. White stands for the froth of the sea, and blue is the sky of Greece. A fear of open spaces, a fear of the marketplace, a fear of going out of doors in the Greek language is agoraphobia. This could be a case of agoraphobia.
We'll see about that in a minute. So you can see they went by sea all the way across. And there's 4 of them, so it wasn't cheap. So somehow Paul's little business that he's got going has been able to make enough money to pay for the passage. So now they are in what is known as Macedonia, present-day Greece. Okay, so there's, we're going to find out that the Greeks are a different sort of people. The Greeks believed that they were the most learned people on the planet. Aristotle, Plato, the whole gang there, and each one trained the other. And that is why Alexander the Great tried to conquer the world, because he was going to upgrade everybody's, shall we say, intellectual knowledge up to the Greek level. That is also why Jesus spoke Greek. Because all the areas that Alexander did conquer, he made them learn the Greek language. So Jesus spoke Greek. And all of the original texts were written in Greek, not Latin. Because all of the disciples and Luke and everybody else were all, Greek scholars. So that, Paul is going here now. Now remember, the Greeks were funny. They still had some people who believed in the same gods as the Romans did. They gave them different names. For example, who is the head of the gods in Greece? That's Zeus, yes. In Rome, his name is Jupiter. So they took all the Greek gods and gave them Latin names. Be that as it may. We'll see a little later in the tape where the gods all lived and how Paul had to go into that very area and try to teach how, that Jesus Christ impacts them and everything else, and there's these temples of the gods right on top of the hill. So you can see this guy, by doing this guy is going into an area where people are not stupid. They're pretty set in their ways. So I need someone to read Acts 16:11 to 15. Okay?
From Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for
Samothrace, yes.
and the next day on to Neapolis. From there we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia. And we stayed there several days. On the Sabbath we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from the city of
Thyatira.
Who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, "come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us.
Stop and think what just happened. Who did Paul meet? What's her name? Lydia. In the Jewish faith, women were seen and not heard. Now, there are exceptions, like the Deborah, the judge, and so on. But for the most part, women were seen and not heard. So the fact that Paul would talk to one is pretty amazing at that time. And not only that, the fact that he would call her a believer is even more significant. Also, notice it said that they went to her household and baptized. That's the way baptisms were done when Paul went around. You baptized an entire household. And when you say the household, you mean the family, the hired people, if they had slaves, it was them, anybody else who was there. So sometimes you're talking as many as 10 to 20 people in one baptism. And that's how it was often done. So you had baptisms of adults, children, infants, heaven knows. So keep that in mind. Lydia is going to appear again and again. So to give you now, we're going to learn a little bit about Philippi. It had a very, very interesting history. I don't know if any of you studied early Greek and Roman history, but you're going to get a little history lesson that you didn't get in the movie Cleopatra. Although it was going on.
Miles away from Neapolis, in this tobacco field, in the year 42 BC, we would have seen the Battle of Philippi taking place. It was a Roman civil war, Roman against Roman. The two conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, had assassinated Julius Caesar, and now they had led their armies into Asia, where they plundered the cities and were in control of the seas from the harbor of Neapolis. Octavian was the grandnephew and adopted son of Julius Caesar. He detested these men who had murdered Caesar. He was harsh to his prisoners of war, but a devoted family man, and very much loved his wife Livia. Antony had pulled his army into position, and it was only natural for him to avenge the assassination of his good friend Caesar. Brutus had a hard face, a stiff, ungracious character, as he showed in his treatment of the Asian cities. Cassius was the first to commit suicide in the Battle of Philippi, and Brutus did the same soon after. But many legionaries fell in battle on both sides. At the very edge of the battleground, the river Ganges ran red with the blood of the legionaries. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. Lydia was the first person in Greece to be baptized by Paul. This ancient road was used to bring the marble from the quarries to be turned into statues. Marble chips can be found easily, and this highway is called the Via Egnatia, named after the Roman engineer who built it, Ignatius. The chariot ruts are carved deep into the paving stones, telling us that they were putting on the brakes at this point to turn into the Forum. Romans built highways much like we do. First, level the surface, create a concave underbed, then fill with sand, rock, and gravel, with the paving stones on top, forming a convex topping to drain off the rainwater. These paving stones are 6 inches thick. That is why the highway used by Paul to walk across Greece is still there. It was here in Philippi that Paul cured a young girl from her talent at seeing the future. The masters realized that.
We'll get to that in a minute. So you see, Philippi was both Greek and Roman. So that's who was living there. Both sides had gods of their own. Although the Greek thinkers were beginning to see that there may be some other god but they didn't know who it was. Okay, so now Paul is walking into this kind of a scenario. Half the people think that the gods live on Mount Olympus, or they live wherever the Romans said they lived, and the other half think there's some god out there, but we don't know what it is. And he's got to tell the story. You think that was going to be easy? Well, let me show you. Let's find out what happened. All right, I need someone to read Acts 16 verses 16 to 24. Okay.
Once when we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. She earned a great deal of money, for her owners by fortune telling. This girl followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who are telling you the way to be saved." She kept this up for many days. Finally, Paul became so troubled that he turned around and said to the spirit, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her." At that moment, the spirit left her. When the owners of the slave girl realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. They brought them before the magistrates and said, "These men are Jews and are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice." The crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten. After they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. Upon receiving such orders, he put them into an inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks.
First attempt didn't go so good, did it? Stop and think of what's going on here. I mean, these guys, there were a couple of really unscrupulous characters. Probably, in today's world, that would have been like carnival people back in the 1800s, that claimed they could tell fortunes and sell you stuff that would grow hair and do all that sort of thing. And as long as it sounded like she was doing it, they were making a big bunch of money. Well, Paul comes along, takes their meal taken away from them. And this did not bode well. So here's
from her talent and fortune telling. So they had Paul and Silas flogged and thrown into prison. When they found he was a Roman citizen, they hurried to set him free and rush him out of the city. That prison is still there in Philippi. And when we read the story in Acts, we see how Paul was freed and even converted and baptized his own jailer.
There it is. Still
In many
there.
of these Roman houses, we find the impluvium, sort of a decorative pool in the atrium. And all the ancient Roman cities had very sophisticated public latrines for travelers. An inscription of the man who built this city, King Philip II of Macedon, who was the father of Alexander the Great. And Plato is mentioned here, and Vespasian, the Roman emperor that built the Colosseum of Rome. They have found at least 2 large Christian churches here in ancient Philippi. Many soldiers were pardoned by Caesar Augustus, the young Octavian, and they colonized Philippi and settled down here with their land grants. It was their grandchildren that were listening to Paul's lectures by the river. Paul and Silas now moved toward Thessalonica, the land.
Okay. The tape told you that something happened in prison. It doesn't tell you what it was. So to find this out, I'm going to read Acts 16:25-40 from the version I have. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. Remember, they're in jail. They're chained up. And the prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was an earthquake so violent that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's chains were unfastened. Remember, I told you, the prison's still there. When the jailer woke up and saw the prison doors wide open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, since he supposed the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted in a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." The jailer called for lights, and rushing in, he fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. Remember the tape said that he converted the jailer? Then he brought them outside and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They answered, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, and you and your household." They spoke the word of the Lord to him and all who were within his house. At the same hour of the night, then he and his entire family were baptized without delay. So this is the second household that was baptized. He brought them up into the house and set food before them, and he and his entire household rejoiced that he had become a believer in God. When the morning came, the magistrates sent the police, saying, "Let those men go." And the jailer reported the message to Paul, saying, "The magistrates sent word to let you go, therefore come out and go in peace." But listen to Paul's reply. He says, "They have beaten us in public, uncondemned men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison, and now they are going to discharge us in secret? Certainly not. Let them come and take us out themselves." The police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. So they came and apologized to them, and they took them out and asked them to leave the city. After leaving the prison, they went to Lydia's home. Remember Lydia? And where they had seen and encouraged the brothers and sisters there, and they departed. Do you see how much power being a Roman citizen had? Remember, it said they were scared to death when they found out what they had done to Paul. So think about it. Paul's already, remember in the preach before, Paul's already been almost stoned once. Now he's gone to prison, lived through an earthquake, been beaten, chained up, and he's still going. This is one committed guy. I mean, think about this. There's an old saying in my day, you don't have to tell me twice. Well, he's already been told twice. And yet he's moving on his way. Now, there is a book called Philippians, correct? You asked the question last week, how did Paul take care of churches that he founded after he left? Well, what would happen is, remember, Lydia is still there, and Lydia's friends are still there. They would send messages to Paul saying, guess what, we're having this problem. And Paul would write a letter to that specific church to address whatever the situation was. And the Philippians was one of those. Now, this is this is some years after the church was started. But that's how they did it. Now he's going to go to a place called, I have to say it for you, Thessalonica. Although some people say Thessalonica, I'm not sure. So basically he's left one city and he's going to another. And somebody want to get him a chair?
Can I ask a question before we start? What I meant was, did the people that were part of the new church have to have like their own separate kind of community because they were still living in Jewish communities which followed all the laws, so they were Jewish by culture but not religion. So
exactly.
That's what I was asking, was like, how did that work for them to live, or they had to kind of separate themselves?
Yes, they did. And in fact, Paul, if you read Paul's writings in his letters, he keeps talking about how you strengthen the body and how the strong should help the weak and so on. That's what he was talking about. You were in a separate community, and some people were not as committed as others. Some were on the edge. So what Paul is saying, hey, work with those people. So he would always appoint elders, if you will, when he would leave. And it was their responsibility to lead this group of followers after they left, after Paul and Silas left. So yes, there was this community, and in the Greek areas there were other communities. There were the Stoics, for instance, who believed in God, but they believed that God was totally separated from us. And there were these spheres you had to go through, and the Stoics believed that the body was evil, but the mind was good. So you didn't really become faithful until you died. So you have that group. You have the group that's still, giving sacrifices in the temples of the gods. You have them there too. So what Paul is saying, hey, if you give them the message, they will join you. So yes, they had some issues, and yes, you can see that not everybody was thrilled with the message Paul was giving. Now we're going to see another city called Thessalonica, and let's find out what's going on there.
Passing through Amphipolis and Apollonia. The ancient cities all seem to be placed within an easy one day's walk from each other. No, you are not in Tibet. This is not Shangri-La. It is the monasteries of Mount Athos. A couple of brothers going fishing this morning. It is likely that fugitives from religious persecution first settled here in the 8th century, if not earlier. This peninsula runs right underneath the route of Paul and extends out into the Aegean Sea for about 31 miles. It has its own administration and is not governed by Athens. In 1312, authority was relinquished from the Byzantine emperor to the patriarch, and to this day they still use the Julian calendar, 13 days behind the rest of Europe. Many orders and many nationalities make up this monastic refuge. There are Russian, Greek, Bulgarian, and Serbian monasteries. No women are allowed on the peninsula, not even as visitors. Even female animals are banned. as are males under 21 years of age.
Talk about a secluded community.
Thessalonica, in northern Greece. This historic city has broad sidewalks and shade trees on every street. It is the second largest city in Greece, next to Athens. The promenade along the seafront goes for several miles and offers a perfect place for the family evening promenade. This is tradition in Greece that can be seen in every city and town. The evening promenade. Paul walks into the city on the Via Egnatia and under the Arch of Galerius, and immediately begins speaking in the synagogue. Who are these Romans we have been talking about? They were a small Latin tribe that learned how to conquer. They learned their fighting skills in the circuses, amazing chariot races. They fought lions so they could learn to fight whole civilizations. They learned how to administer to an empire and tax their subjects, and as long as they could conquer, they would flourish. Even though most of the emperors were cruel and incompetent, they would survive for 1,000 years as a major power. They copied the Roman form from the Greek agora, and copied the best from all civilizations that they conquered, learning something from everybody. The zealots went to the house of Jason to arrest Paul, but this man Jason outsmarted them.
Let's not worry about Jason next time. So you can see the Romans were not like the Greeks. The Greeks would philosophize and think and debate and do all that stuff. The Romans just came and what's the best you got, and we'll just use it. Okay? So also you'll notice that all of that stuff is still there. I mean, you wonder where in the heck they figured out in all those movies how those people dressed. Well, you got those statues that are still there that give you some clue. But you can see now he's going into a Thessalonica is a Roman area, and they are copying things. And you notice the modern city has grown up all around this, but that stuff is still there. And what's amazing, like I said, is Paul is walking this whole time, or getting a ride from someone on probably a donkey or something. And you look at the map and you say, that doesn't look that far. But how far can you walk in a day? What is the average American can walk like 4 miles an hour? It's something like that. I think it is. So you figure, if I got to go 50 miles, that's an awful lot of hours. Plus you got to stop and rest somewhere along the line, and I don't think they had rest areas back then. So this is one committed group of people. That's why you didn't go by yourself. You always had people with you, because that way you can share meals and share the duties and do all that other kind of thing. So now Paul's going to end up in Thessalonica, and we're going to find that things are a little different there. Also, keep this in mind. There's a book called the Thessalonians. How many are there? 2. You asked how Paul keeps track of things. Well, he had to write 2 letters, because the first letter didn't exactly work out the way he planned, so he had to write a second one. And when we get into that a little later, you're going to see how he starts off every letter. To my brothers and sisters in the church of whatever. So this, and you say, well, he's just writing letters. Well, in those days, paper was very expensive. And not only that, you didn't write stuff down and then throw it in the wastebasket. I mean, because you couldn't. So what each of these people had was some sort of a recording secretary, if you will. Also, all the writings in those days did not have spaces, and they did not have punctuation. So when you read it, you had to know where the sentences ended. Also, you will find that there are a couple of places where Paul writes some of the longest sentences ever written. It's like, you know, it's like 35 words is one sentence. In fact, it's like 4 verses. It's all one sentence. And that's because Paul is trying to conserve. You know, he's only got so much money. But the point of the matter is, all of these letters survive. And you say, well, how do they know Paul wrote them? Well, the scholars go through and they look at how the sentence structure is. They look at how he uses verbs and nouns, and how you know, the type of conversation that he has in his writing. And the scholars have determined that a lot of the letters, most of what you read in the Bible, the letters of Paul are really either written by Paul or dictated to someone who wrote them for him. So that's pretty much where we are. So he's on his way, he's in Greece, he's got all kinds of special characters he has to deal with. So next week we're going to find that it gets even more fun. And I don't know about you, but you know, some of the stuff that he's already gotten into makes me a little nervous just thinking about it. So, but the neat thing, as I said, the reason I bring the tape is you can see that stuff is still there. Notice what they said about the roads. The roads are still walked on. I mean, we can't fix I-90 the last 4 years, right? Can we? What's that?
I have a question. Something that's bothering me. On Paul circumcised Timothy.
Right.
Timothy had to be an adult. Don't they normally circumcise
Yes, they do.
babies?
Yes, they do.
But that's got to be pretty painful.
Yeah, it is. But at the same time, the reason he did it was credibility. He didn't want to have people questioning, well, this guy, you know, he's Greek, he's not, what does he know? So what he's saying is that, you know, the fact he is Jewish, he's half Jewish, on his mother's side, he did go through the faith, he does understand what he's talking about, and as we'll see later, Paul will say some of the most wonderful things about Timothy and his service to, you know, to the early church. So this was the right guy. And you're also going to learn that he has a family that is going to be also very, very important to Paul. And you're going to learn all their names. And they're all women.
Would Lydia kind of be considered like the first priest or minister, or how do you want to put it?
Yeah, she would be she's an elder, okay? Yeah, that would be correct. Remember, it's the first person baptized in all of that area. So she became like the leader of her group that was being formed. She would be put on a higher level, you know, like a member session, if you will. But she did a lot of the early preaching and spread the good news. And what's interesting is, remember, she just heard about it herself. One last thing for today. You wonder why in the heck the good news was so important. Think about what they were talking about. There's a God that loves you. There's a God that cares about you. There's a God that will give you eternal life. There's the Son of God, Jesus, who is watching over you. All the other gods, you had to go buy sacrifices and hope they didn't strike you dead. And they believed that anything bad that happened to you was because you infuriated one of these gods, whoever it was. And once you figured it out, you had to go to one of their temples and give them sacrifices and hope that God would forgive you. So to hear that there's this God you don't have to go to temple for, and you don't have to give sacrifices to, and cares about you no matter who you are, this is important stuff to them. They've never heard such a thing. And as a result, a whole lot of people want to get on the early bandwagon because it sounds good to them. Okay? So yes, Lydia is going to be, Lydia you will find it becomes a very, very important person in the early church. As you will find out, Timothy's relatives will be too. And also notice he says the dealer in purple cloth. What's purple the color of? Royalty. So this is not just some, somebody with a kiosk out in the, this is an important person. He's got a good business going. And she's willing to risk that in order to become part of the new faith. So next week we're going to have some more fun with Thessalonica or Thessalonica. We'll vote on what we'll call it. And as you can see, it's going to be more and more fun as we go because now he's running into more and more different mindsets. And not only that, he has to preach in places where not a whole lot of folks like what he has to say. Now the people that follow him do, but the others who are making money off of, for example, keep this in mind. Remember, you notice how many Virgin Marys there are around Cleveland in front lawns? Well, they used to make idols the same way. And the guys who made those idols, all of a sudden their business went down. And they're not too thrilled. All right, well thanks a lot. We got to get it ready for church.